Hello again, it's Alister McGrath. I'm an academic at Oxford University. I want to explore with you some of the big issues relating to science, atheism, certainty and Christianity. And as an atheist teenager back in the 1960s, I was just convinced that science could answer all of life's deepest questions. And so science became my exclusive guide to reality. It seemed to offer me clear, crisp and certain answers to every question of importance about life. And back then I just couldn't cope with the idea of living with uncertainty and ambiguity. I wanted to know what was right, what was wrong, and I refused to accept that there were questions which couldn't be answered with complete clarity and certainty. So I longed to know what life was all about, but without any doubt or ambiguity. And I believed at that time that atheism gave me those certain answers to those big questions. Science was about facts, and religious belief, well, it was about running away from reality. It was about making up your beliefs to suit your tastes and your needs. Then I began to realize that actually we need more than facts in life. Now let me explain what I mean by that. Back in the late 1960s, I took the view that life was about assembling a collection of proven facts on which I could base my life. And that was a very simple philosophy, although looking back, I think I can now see it was really very inadequate. It failed to recognize, for example, that facts can be extremely dull and devoid of any existential significance at all. Knowing the dates of birth and death of English kings and queens makes no difference to me at all. You see, facts matter, but they aren't enough. Human beings need more than facts. And there's more to it than that, because facts need to be interpreted so that we can understand what they mean. So we need a way of being able to make sense of them, asking what deeper pattern these facts disclose. And the French mathematician and philosopher of science, Henri Poincaré, wrote these words, which I think are very wise and helpful here. Science is built out of facts in the same way as a house is built of stones, yet an accumulation of facts is no more science than a pile of stones is a house. Now, I hope you can see the point he's trying to make here. He's emphasizing it's not enough to accumulate observations about life or facts about our world. We need to see how they fit into something bigger. It's like building a house out of stones. The stones are still there in the final house, and you can study them individually, but, and here's the really important part, they are part of something that is bigger. A house is not just a pile of stones, because the stones are now interconnected. They're part of a larger structure. And that's the point I want to emphasize, that observations need to be fitted into an explanatory framework so that we can see what they mean. Facts aren't enough. It's the structure that they generate that matters more than its individual components. So my point is that we need to do more than simply accumulate facts and observations. We need to arrange these into a structure so that they can show us a big picture. So as we observe the world around us and reflect on our own experiences, we often find ourselves looking to find this bigger picture that lies behind what we can observe and experience. In other words, we're looking for an interconnected web, a way of actually seeing how things hang together. Now, I think the image of weaving is really helpful here. It's a way of disclosing or generating patterns by weaving threads together. Now, sometimes I admit we invent those patterns, but others seem to have some deeper rooting in the world around us, and facts are like those threads. We need to weave those threads together to find out what bigger picture or what deeper pattern they disclose. And it's the pattern that really matters, not the individual facts or observations. Now, looking back, I can see that part of the attraction of the natural sciences to me was they seemed to rest on absolutely reliable evidence. and I embraced a rather crude scientific positivism, I think without realizing just how simplistic and shallow it was. But I also failed to appreciate how this did not deal with life's big questions. So I think I need to explain why scientific positivism was so disappointing in this vitally important respect. Now, we need more than facts, we need more than science. And as a teenage free-thinking atheist, I took the view that science was my exclusive guide to life. There was no other, I thought, reliable source of knowledge. And yet, although I was a little uncritical in this belief, I began to realize that there might be an intellectual problem here. The arguments my atheist friends presented in favor of their position, which I somewhat uncritically absorbed and repeated, were actually circular. Now, let me explain, because this is a big issue. How could I or anyone prove that science alone can tell us what is right? Now, if science is the only reliable source and criterion of knowledge, then the belief that science alone can tell us what is right has to be proved scientifically. There's no other valid form of reasoning. It has to be science. So you end up by proving, in inverted commas, that science is the only meaningful criterion of truth or assessment by using science itself, because there is no alternative way of judging it on the basis of your approach. And it's obvious this argument presupposes and validates its own conclusions. Science, which of course is uniquely and exclusively authoritative, confirms its own authority. But that's clearly a circular argument. It has to assume its conclusions if it's going to work at all. And of course, it was certain in the sense that it was a closed circle, but only because it was circular. Now, I think most people would say you can get around this problem quite easily by recognizing that there are other grounds which can be used to justify the authority of science. And I would not agree with that position. But I have to say it was a very unsettling thought to me back in the late 1960s. I think you can see why. If I relied on anything beyond science to prove science's authority, it would mean conceding that something beyond science had authority. So my own solution to this problem back then was really very slick and simple. Since it was so obvious to me as a scientist that science was our exclusive guide to reality, this didn't need to be proved. It was just obviously right. Anyway, realizing there were some problems emerging, I assumed that once I got up to Oxford University, I could begin serious reflection on natural sciences, and these difficulties would sort themselves out. They would no longer represent a problem. But that actually wasn't how things worked out. For a start, I began to read Albert Einstein. So let me tell you about that. In my first term as a student at Oxford, I began to read the works of Albert Einstein, who I have to say was refreshingly aware of the complexities of the issues that I've been talking about and the limits of the natural science. And I got to know Einstein really well as a thinker during my first year at Oxford University. In fact, he remains a very important influence on me today. So what does Einstein have to say about this? Well, Einstein gave a landmark lecture at Princeton in 1939. And in this lecture, Einstein declared that the natural sciences were outstanding in their sphere of competence. He was absolutely clear about that. These are really important. They're really good. But he did enter a note of caution. What about ethics? What about questions of meaning in life? And his point is science can't deal with these. Listen to what he says. The scientific method can teach us nothing else beyond how facts are related to and conditioned by each other. Now that's important, because Einstein declared that human beings need more than what he termed a purely rational conception of our existence. And for Einstein, the fundamental beliefs which he believed to be, and I quote, necessary and determinate for our conduct and judgments actually could not be established scientifically. They were there, but science couldn't take you to them. You had to derive them by other intellectual methods. And Einstein was absolutely emphatic. This was not a criticism of science. It was simply a proper recognition of the limits of science. Now, Einstein was clear that going beyond science in the human quest for moral values and personal meaning was not about lapsing into some kind of superstitious irrationality. Rather, it was just necessary. Listen to what he says. Objective knowledge provides us with powerful instruments for the achievements of certain ends, but the ultimate goal and the longing to reach it must come from another source. Now, that, I think, is very interesting. What Einstein is saying here, I think, is that science can help us achieve certain goals that we believe to be important, but it can't actually identify which goals are good and right, and nor can science motivate us to actually achieve them. And Einstein's point is both the knowledge of those goals and the motivation to reach them have to come from beyond science. Now again, let me make it clear, Einstein is not criticizing science. He's very clear. It is a wonderful toolbox for exploring our world. It's just that we need other toolboxes as well. And happily, other toolboxes are available. Let's do a mental experiment. I want you to imagine that I have a thermometer in my hand. Now, a thermometer is an instrument. It's a tool. And you know it works brilliantly when I need to know my temperature, see if there's something wrong with me. So it's a great tool, and it works well for telling my temperature. But suppose I were to argue like this. Because the thermometer works so well in telling me my temperature, why not use it for everything else? After all, the fact it works in one very specific area so well means I can extend its use to every other area, including questions of value and meaning. Now, I think, and I hope, that you'll feel this is one of the worst lines of argument you have ever heard. So, suppose I wanted to know the meaning of life. I could look at a thermometer, and the thermometer somehow seems unable to answer this question. So I might conclude that because the thermometer hasn't determined any meaning in life, then there is no meaning in life. I hope you can see the point that I'm trying to make. It's nonsense. All our research methods are developed with a very specific task in mind. And the fact that a tool works very well in, for example, measuring temperatures or looking at the stars does not mean that this same tool can tell us what is good or what is meaningful. And you know, it's the same with science. It works really well for some tasks, but not for all of them. We need more than science to answer life's big questions. And again, that is no criticism of science. It's just recognizing science has its limits. Now, when I was 16, I completely failed to see this point. I took the view that there was only one right answer to all of life's questions, and that this answer was provided by science. And I now realize that we need to think of human knowledge in terms of a spectrum of possibilities. Some knowledge is scientific, some knowledge is historical, some is ethical, some is religious. But here's the point. Science does not put history or philosophy or theology out of business. What we clearly need to do, I think, is to bring a professional philosopher into this conversation. So in a moment, I'm going to move on to explore this question in dialogue with Mary Midgley. Mary Midgley is one of Britain's best known and most respected public philosophers. And she, I think you'll find, has something really interesting to say on this big question. Now, I got to know Mary Midgley when I lectured at the University of Newcastle up in the northeast of England back in the year 2008. And I'd just given a lecture about Richard Dawkins' views on science and religion, and Midgley asked if we could talk about this whole question over a cup of tea afterwards. Now, I was delighted to do it because I read quite a few books by her and was really interested to know what she thought about this matter. So we talked about the challenges that we face as we try to make sense of our complicated world. Now, Midgley is very interesting. She insists that different disciplines use different intellectual toolkits in order to engage and to capture the complexity of our world. And these different toolkits or toolboxes are designed to ask different questions. And furthermore, there are certain questions that are of fundamental importance to human beings which science is unable to answer using its own toolbox. Now, I've made that point already, and Midgley makes this point very strongly indeed. And Midgley's point here is not only to avoid the dangers of scientific overreach, in which science trespasses into other areas, but to avoid the intellectual impoverishment which results from limiting our understanding of the world to a single disciplinary approach. Now, I think she needs to be listened to carefully here. Here's what she has to say. No one pattern of thought, not even in physics, is so fundamental that all others will eventually be reduced to it. Instead, for most important questions in life, a number of different conceptual toolboxes always have to be used together. That's a very important point. For important questions in life, we have to use a range of conceptual toolboxes together. So I hope you can see the point she's making. Science can't answer all our questions about life. It's very good, of course, at answering scientific questions, but it's not really very good answering moral or existential or religious questions, especially, of course, anything to do with values or meaning in life. Now, if you insist that science is your only source of knowledge, then I'm afraid this means you have no valid reason for allowing there's a difference between right and wrong or good and bad. And that's not because there is no good, no bad. It's because your highly restrictive views on how we arrive at truth means you just can't engage moral questions. Because if reality is limited to what science tells us, then that simply excludes from the realm of the real things like moral values or beliefs about the meaning of life. These are not, I must stress, discredited or disproved. They're simply excluded by this very narrow view of reality. Now, obviously, Richard Dawkins would not agree with Mary Midgley at this point. For Dawkins, science is our only reliable intellectual authority. And this view, which is sometimes known as scientism, again, scientism, has become the hallmark of the new atheism as Dawkins and others. I have to say it's not well regarded. It's widely criticised by philosophers, both religious and atheist, for two reasons, both of which I think are very important. First of all, because of its obvious failure to respect the complexity of our world, but secondly, its refusal to recognise the need for multiple toolkits to engage this complex reality. Dawkins can only offer us a scientific perspective on the world, which he unwisely assumes is the same as telling us exactly what the world is like. He limits himself to a single toolkit, telling us this is the only toolkit we're allowed to use. But unsurprisingly, his overstatements go far beyond what science can tell us. I suppose he hopes that nobody's going to notice how dependent he is on sources other than science in reaching those conclusions. Now it's time for us to move on. In this presentation, I've explored my growing realization that science offers us an incomplete account of reality. Science fills in some of the big picture of life, and that's great. But we need to know more. We need to draw on other sources to fill in the remainder of that picture. This, I have to say, is now very clear to me, but back when I was a teenager, I failed to see it completely. I know I should have, but the fact is, I didn't. I'll talk more about this in the next presentation, so thank you so much for listening, and I hope to speak to you again very soon.